You're locked into Inception Radio Network, Superior, Wisconsin.
Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. Oh my God. You know, I say this every week, but it just keeps getting better. This week, we're going to be speaking to a good friend of mine, Laird Scranton, about is sophisticated science coded in early symbols? But Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com, where you can find out about all the products and services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, energy healing, and psychic reading. So if there's stuff going on in your life, you need some insight, some guidance, or some help, give me a call, drop me an email, and we can set up a time for a private consultation in person, over the phone, and even via Skype. It's also brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com, where you can jumpstart your intuition today by downloading their free 50-page Jumpstart Your Intuition Guide. If you've missed an episode of Just Energy Radio, there are many places that you can catch up. You can go to the Just Energy Radio webpage. That's www.justenergyradio.com, where we actually have almost 8 full years of archives on the site. While you're there, sign up for our free newsletter to keep you informed of who's coming up on the show. You can go to our YouTube channel, that's Just Energy Radio on YouTube, and check out the show there. It's on iTunes, so you can get the RSS feed, or you can come here to the Inception Radio webpage and check out the shows on their site as well. And I'm just thinking, do I have any other announcements? And I don't think so, at least not that I can think of in the moment. So let me tell you a little bit about our guest and bring him on the air. Laird Scranton is an independent software designer from Albany, New York. His degree in English from Vassar College. He has lectured at Colgate University on 2 occasions to classes studying his books. He was invited to write 3 articles for Temple University's upcoming Encyclopedia of African Religion and has a published article on Dogon cosmology. I think, Laird, we need a new biography. In the April 2007 edition of Anthropology News, an academic journal produced by the University of Chicago. He's written several books on comparative cosmology, and we're going to be talking about his new book, China's Cosmological Prehistory. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio, Laird Scranton. Hey, Laird, how are you?
Hey, Dr. Rita. I'm great. How are you?
I am great. So I just want to do a little shout out to your other half, which I won't say her name because I don't want her be pissed off at me. But hey, because I know she's listening in the background because I know all of her secrets. Anyway, I know you have just been busy, and I'm glad that you were able to take some time out and talk about your new book, China's Cosmological Prehistory. And I have to tell you, I was going through it for the show. I was like, okay, but you don't have time to read the whole thing. But it was really good. I was really enjoying it. So,
well, thanks.
So people need to buy it because it's a good book. How's that? Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, at your local bookstore. Because it just came out, right?
That's right. It was just a week and a half ago it came out. I'm excited to finally have a copy to look at.
See, I always love being on the cutting edge of when these books come out and hit the market. So, so where I want to start, and I'm going to say where we last left off, but that's kind of a lie. But we were talking about cosmology, about the Dogon, and about Egypt. What drew you in this book to start researching the cosmology of China?
Well, it's been sort of a progression that's moved from Africa to Egypt to India and then to Tibet, and now with this book on to ancient China. And what it really comes out of is the same instinct that Jung had, that there were fundamental relationships to these symbols in these ancient cultures, that there are similarities that are very hard to explain through normal, academic means. Something funny is going on. Jung decided that it might involve a collective unconsciousness, or might involve just the way that we are mentally wired to perceive concepts of creation. So I've been pursuing these similarities between cultures. My field is called comparative cosmology. I basically compare the myths and symbols and words and rituals of various ancient cultures to try to learn more about them. And so China was sort of the next logical step in the progression for me.
Well, and one of the things that I really like that you bring into the picture that a lot of people don't do, I mean, there are people that look at the linguistic part, but you really get into the symbols and the written part of the language, not just the spoken part, correct?
That's right, and it's an interesting process because these creation traditions started out before written language. I mean, in most cultures, it's understood that they had these symbols and they had these concepts of cosmology before writing existed. And so that makes it particularly tricky when you're dealing with a subject where there is no written text to rely on. And China is sort of that kind of a case. But yes, I get down into the symbols and the written words because that's really where all the information is. They tell you that again and again and again. Even in the in Genesis, there's the emphasis on the concept of the word. And you look at these ancient traditions, it's all the word, the word, the word, the word, the word. And the reason for that is there's all sorts of information to be found hidden in these words.
Well, and kind of, when I think of the idea of the word, especially in like biblical tradition, there's the whole, and God said, which emphasizes the idea of the spoken word of vibration. And in creation cosmology obviously forms the basis of every culture. In the West, Chinese culture, I don't know, it always just seems like a mystery. What's going on in India? What's going on in China? We kind of have a hard time wrapping our mind around because it just seems so foreign. So based on your research, have you uncovered recurring symbols that link East to West, and so that what we're actually seeing might not be as foreign as we think?
Yeah, that's really the foundation of it. That when you get down to the bottom of all of these ancient traditions, you are running into stuff that is fundamentally similar to one another. And the trick is to find ways to positively correlate what happens in Africa to what happens in India, or what happens in Egypt to what happens in China. And China is a particularly difficult case because events that transpired around 3000 BC didn't get written down, or at least we don't have written texts, before around 300 BC. And so you have the span of almost 3,000 years where we don't know whether the people who wrote it down right or not. And all the academic researchers are fight among themselves over little tiny nuances of what this symbol means or what this word means. It's very tricky to try to anchor an interpretation in that kind of a situation.
Well, correct me, but wasn't it China that at some point in time during the Han Dynasty, I don't remember the exact one, they actually had a book burning as well?
Yes, they did. They had a lot of different things happen over periods of time. Like, for example, in 1100 AD, there was a multi-volume text on Buddhism published, but the emperor banned certain references from being included in the book, and banned certain images from even being seen in China. So there's certain things depending on the culture you go to, there's certain aspects of this tradition that you can't find evidence of because it was banned.
Shocking. That's because they didn't have the internet and Facebook. And
That's right.
So when you're talking about, this following of symbols and language across culture, could you give an example or two just to kind of give the listeners an idea of what you're talking about? Obviously, the symbol might be a little more challenging because it's visual, but I'm sure you'll figure it out.
Yes. Well, okay, if I had started this project with perfect knowledge about how the systems interrelate to one another, there's a very simple way to show that what we have in China is dramatically similar to what we have in ancient Egypt. You can actually demonstrate it with a single word. In ancient Egypt, the way that the written language works, the traditional Egyptologists think that the language was phonetic. But I look at the language and I say, we've got 40,000 or 4,000 glyphs to represent 40 or 50 phonetic values. I don't think it was phonetic. They didn't need that many glyphs. So my approach to the language has been a symbolic approach. I think that each of the glyphs represents a concept or an object. It's something tangible that you can associate with that picture. Okay, the Egyptian word for week is a very straightforward word. It's written with two glyphs in Egypt. It's written with a sun glyph, which is a circle with a dot in the middle of it, and that represents the concept of a day, and then with an upside down U, which was the Egyptian number 10. And I looked at that word and I said to myself, symbolically, this says 10 days. And I did some research and I discovered the Egyptians had a 10-day week. And
Okay.
so I was
We're going to come back to that one because I had a follow-up question, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, so the idea that a word could tell me its own meaning if I understood the meanings of the symbols properly was really interesting to me. And I wondered, could any of the other words in Egypt have worked that same way? Mm-hmm. And when I started researching it, I discovered they all work that way. That if you know the right meaning to associate with a symbol, you can create a symbolic sentence out of a word that tells you what it means. So
all right, let me just throw this one little thing in. So when you looked at the sun with the upside down U, that meant week. And so when you've looked at these other things, it might have been like 4 pictures, and I'm going to shut up because I can't even explain myself.
No, so they're the two symbols in the word, and the symbols say 10 days, and that's the definition of a week. When you go to China, they have an ancient word for week that is also written with just 2 symbols. It's the Chinese sun glyph, which started out as a circle with a dot in the middle of it, and the Chinese number 10. It also reads 10 days, and the Chinese also had a 10-day week. In other words, these 2 hieroglyphic languages work in fundamentally similar ways in defining the meanings of their words and the way the words are written.
And they both had 10-day weeks.
Now, unfortunately, in China, there's a very famous myth about an archer who shoots 9 of 10 suns out of a tree. And so the Chinese scholars come along and they look at that word for week and they say, look, it says 10 suns because it's the sun glyph that represents the concept of a day. They never connect with the fact that the word says 10 days. Mm-hmm. So understanding that, you can see that the cosmology that is behind the symbols has to be the same in China and Egypt. And the way that cosmology was represented in written language was the same in China and Egypt. And so if you had that as your only starting point, you could have a lot of confidence that what you were going to find in the rest of the tradition was going to line up pretty well.
I mean, that's just, just that very simplistic concept just says so much, just right there. But I want to take a little detour because you threw in the 10-day thing, and I, when I was reading, and let me just see. Okay, because in your book you mentioned that both the Egyptians and the Chinese had a 10-day week. So total detour here. Does this 10-day week support your work associated with Velikovsky's theory?
Yeah, yes and no. There's evidence on both sides of the scale for that one. What it looks to me is as if the many cultures who all had a 360-day year for thousands of years, and who all suddenly changed to a 365-day year at the same moment in time around 750 BC, that says to me, looking at it from the outside, that on the planet we must have had a 360-day year, and then it somehow changed to a 365-day year. Otherwise, you have to ask yourself, what impulse was it that caused people all the way across the world from each other to all change their calendars in the same way at the same moment, if they weren't responding to a real change in the length of the year?
Mm-hmm.
And so, looked at from that perspective, I did some research in my Velikovsky book. I asked my friend John Anthony West, who's connected with Egyptian scholars. I wanted his friends who knew about the Egyptian calendars to explain to me in the simplest possible terms why it was that ancient Egypt had to have had a 365-day year in ancient times. And the problem is none of them can do that. All of the evidence they provided me with is ambiguous. You can look at it one way and say they had a 360-day ceremonial year that was reconciled to a 365-day solar year using 5 leap year days. Or you can say they had a 359-day lunar year plus a one-day New Year's Day makes 300 and I'm sorry, 300 and the lunar year reconciling to it ended up being 55 days reconciled to 360 days. No, I got that backwards. It's 360 days reconciled to 365 days. It's reconciling the lunar year to a calendar year that changed in 750 BC. So the choice is either you had a ceremonial year of 360 days reconciled to a real year of 365, or you had an original year of 360 days that suddenly had to be reconciled to a new year of 365. And when you look at the evidence, you can't, there's nothing to make a decisive determination which of those two things were true. All the Egyptian evidence is given in terms of a number of months and a number of days, but the lunar months had the same names as the solar months. And so, were they talking about 12 lunar months and 5 days, or were they talking about 12 solar months and 5 days? Every other culture that had leap year days was talking about lunar months and a solar year.
Okay. All right, but now you have me thinking, do you have any idea when the Egyptians changed from a 10-day week to a 7-day week, or did they ever change to a 7-day week?
I'm presuming they did. I don't know what's currently observed in Egypt, but I'm pretty sure it's a 7-day week. The Dogon, though, who are very similar to the Egyptians, now observe a 5-day week. I think a 10-day week was too long to go without a day off.
They need their downtime. Well,
That's right.
I mean, we're both so much alike this way. I mean, because I'm going, okay, so if Egypt had a 10-day week, and then the Jews came out of Egypt, then they started going with a 7-day week. So was that part of their tradition? Where did that whole thing come from? Because, there are those people that say that, it was all Moses was Egyptian and he brought their material with them, but the 10-day week would have come with them as well. I mean, unless they were tired and they needed more time off, which is possible, but...
Well, each of these cultures have numerous calendars, so it's hard to say which one was adopted by whom. A 7-day week is cosmological. This is a week that's based on 7 stages of creation that relate to how matter forms. And the 7th day is the last day. The seventh stage of creation is the last stage, and it's a stage at which one structure forms and another structure starts to form. And so the whole concept of the 7-day week connects to that cosmology. I'm not sure at what point in time that became the dominant calendar. The Dogon and the Egyptians both have, as I say, numerous sets of calendars they use for different purposes. They had one calendar for agriculture that for the Dogon started at the time of the new harvest. They had a solar calendar that started at the heliacal rising of Sirius, the point where Sirius reappears after a period where you can't see it. And there are numerous other calendars that they have in common with one another. And I'm sure the 7-day calendar was based on cosmology and was one of these additional calendars that was carried forward by the priests.
Okay. Well, and 7 in metaphysical terms comes up over and over again. I mean, that number is just kind of a consistent number you see between cultures talking about these processes and cycles and layers and levels and vibrations over and over again.
That's right. And from my perspective, that all boils down to this plan of cosmology that I've been studying. The Dogon and the Egyptians consider it to be, or the Dogons and the Buddhists consider it to be an instructed plan. Someone who knew more than they did in ancient times developed a plan of, it was actually a civilizing plan that was meant to raise us up from the level of hunter-gatherers to farmers. But they didn't believe in teaching one thing at a time. They taught multiple things at the same time. So this plan to civilize us was connected to a plan that a system that described processes of creation. The way the Dogon plow their field or the way they weave a cloth has cosmological symbolism. The way they build their house has cosmological symbolism. Everything they do basically in the Dogon culture, which is similar to what the Egyptians did, I think around 3200 BC, every aspect of their culture ties back to reinforce this cosmology and the teaching of this civilizing plan.
Well, one of the things that I believe is that, the symbols and even the days of the week, kind of listening to what you're talking about, were kind of like mnemonics for much deeper levels of understanding.
That's right. And there's nothing in the system that doesn't have multiple levels to it. The Dogon describe it, they compare it to the layers of skin on an onion, that you pull one back and you discover there's yet another one to be pulled back, and you just keep doing that. My whole process of study has shown that to be true. Every time I think I get to the bottom of something, I discover there's another level to it.
Oh, no kidding. I mean, one of the things that always this has amazed me from years and years and years and years, but when I was just still a grasshopper learning, stuff, so when I still had like a real regular job, that many gajillion years ago, that whoever came up with these systems, that was when I was really studying Kabbalah and studying the chakras and these systems of understanding, had to have known much more than us, because they are so detailed and so complex and so interweaving that a lifetime of study you just barely touch the surface of.
That's right. And even the ancient Greek philosophers who spent time studying with the Egyptians would typically spend 20 or more years studying before they would go back and do their writing.
That's just amazing. And, and I'm sure, but even in Egypt, and correct me if I'm wrong, they had priests who were in charge of this and priests who were in charge of this. And so it wasn't that there was just one group that had all the knowledge. It was kind of spread around to a bunch of different people, wasn't it?
Well, that's right. And I'm seeing signs of that as you go back farther and try to make sense of what the Dogon and the Buddhists describe in terms of an instructed civilizing plan, that there seem to have been very archaic high mountaintop sanctuaries of the sort like you find at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the giant megalithic site that is so old that the stones predate the first evidence we have of tools capable of building them.
And so you think that that might have been a place where our ancestors received this learning?
Based on what the
Possibly.
Dogon and the Buddhists say, I think that it was, and I think that these sanctuaries specialized, just as you said, the priests do. I think that at Göbekli Tepe they were primarily teaching stonemasonry, skills of extracting stone, carving stone, moving it, lifting it, putting it into place, and building with it. Whereas there are other sanctuaries like Catalhaulic looks like it specialized in weaving.
Interesting. And I didn't mean to be chuckling in the background, but I was just thinking, oh, that was shop class. It was rock shop as opposed
Yes,
to
it
metal
was.
shop.
No, but I use that comparison a lot of times. You see the Great Pyramid in Egypt that's perfect, letter perfect. And I say, remember back to shop class when the teacher wanted you to build, let's say wood shop class, you were supposed to build a bookshelf. And he would start out the beginning of the class showing you the perfect example of a bookshelf that he had built. And then everybody goes off to make theirs. But the ones that everybody in the class makes, that the students make, are far less perfect than the one that the teacher made to begin with. Well, this is what I see with pyramids in Egypt. I see certain pyramids like the Great Pyramid that look to be the work of the teachers, and other pyramids that look to be the work of the students.
So here's the $1,000,000 question, Laird. So who were the teachers?
Well, it depends on who you ask. The Buddhists flatly say that what they call the, quote, most sacred of their symbols were given to them by a non-human source. That's flatly understood in Buddhism. That comes from Adrian Snodgrass, who is a leading authority on Buddhist architecture and symbolism from University of Sydney in Australia, University of West Sydney. The Dogon also say that their system was given to them by a non-human source, but they go a little bit farther in their descriptions. They say not only was it non-human, it was also non-physical, meaning that it was something that was, how can I explain this, essential in nature as opposed to physical in nature. It wasn't matter, it was more like spirit. But it was it was physical enough at the point that they were instructed that the teachers were concerned about what kind of long-term effects there might be on the students from spending so much time around them, the teachers. Mm-hmm. And so their solution to the problem of how to limit that exposure was to take 8 tribes member of the Dogon and sequester them at a sanctuary like Göbekli Tepe and teach them what they needed to know, and then send those 8 back to teach everybody else. And so you have these traditions all over the world of the 8 teachers who came in ancient times and taught them agriculture and taught them metalworking and stoneworking and weaving and all these other skills, mathematics.
That's a really interesting concept, because also back in those my ancient days, I always thought that Moses created the tabernacle with the Holy of Holies because that's where he hung out with God. And I always felt like it was to limit exposure because it wasn't that we couldn't handle being around God, but it was more like he didn't really want to be around us. That, there was some issue being around all the people, and there was this whole thing about ritual purity and blah 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 that they didn't really. We were dirty.
Well, I think that there were potential dangers both directions from what I can see, but I'd see a lot of effort being put into trying to protect us from what exposure to them would do, and I know from my own experience with people who've been involved in certain areas of research in physics that there are certain bad things that happen to people who get too close to these processes by which matter is created. That when you get too close to that sort of that edge between non-existence and existence, funny things happen to a person.
Ooh, like
I would
what?
not. Well, there's a certain kind of crazy, for one thing, that goes. Have you ever heard of a book called The Philadelphia Experiment?
Uh-huh.
Okay, in uh, that book, which may or may not be fiction, describes an ostensible attempt on the part of our military to make a ship invisible in Philadelphia Harbor back in World War II. And the book describes some really horrible things that happened to the sailors who were on board the ship. And the ones who managed to survive end up being crazy in a very specific kind of a way. It's hard to describe what it is, but when you've seen it once, you recognize it. Um, and I can understand that if it's that sort of bad thing that might happen to humans from exposure to these kinds of processes, that somebody who is genuinely concerned about us would want to protect us from that.
Yeah, I could imagine that. Um, so let's move on. So they came down here. They're giving us this information, but why? Why? Why break the Prime Directive?
Well, for the same reason that FEMA is supposed to go in after a hurricane and help the people who were victims of the hurricane recover. It looks to me like a sort of a Peace Corps effort after a disaster. It looks like periodically what happens in the solar system is that there are certain forces that cause the Earth's axis tilt to change. And when that happens, ice caps melt and weather patterns become exaggerated and very and they change rapidly. Climates change so that you can't grow crops where you used to grow crops. And I think that just before 10,000 BC, there was a change in the tilt of the axis of the Earth, and that a team was sent in to try to help us recover from that. Part of the reason I think that is because the words that some of the cultures use to describe this instructional effort, some of the Egyptians talk about the first time, and the Buddhists talk about the first time knowledge was passed to humanity from Buddha. But the words that the Buddhists and the Egyptians use to describe that correlate to Dogon words that talk about humanity being restored to culture. So the Dogon perspective makes it look like things were fine up to a point, and then a disaster hit, and after that disaster, we needed help getting back on our feet.
Interesting. I think it's interesting that you're putting the 10,500 year time frame on it, and I'm not necessarily going to disagree. But how do you think, because in China and in Egypt, their documentation of rulership goes back 25,000 years or 35,000 years, depending on who you're talking to. Do you think there was possibly some other event that happened at that point in time, and then we had this disaster at 10,000 BC?
The evidence I see, again, there's a balance of evidence for and against that. I'll give you an example. When I was studying a Tibetan tribe called the Naki, every time I study one of these groups, I try to find an anthropologist who has worked with a group, buy their book, read through their descriptions of what's been learned about the culture. And anytime I find information that overlaps with what I'm studying that I might have a perspective on, I contact the author by email and start a dialogue back and forth to discuss the issues. Mm-hmm. And one of the issues with this tribe in Tibet was they had one of these king lists that went way, way back. But the problem was the earliest names on the list, they could see that these were not Tibetan or Chinese names. The names were based on some other language than Tibet and China. And there were debates back and forth about, could there have been a Mongolian influence, or could there have been an influence from India, or could it come from Siberia, or where did it come from? But I could tell, looking at the list of names, that the phonetic values represent stages of creation in the cosmology. These are the same series of phonetic values in the same order that I expect to find them when we describe these stages of creation. So I look at the king list in Tibet and I say, it's clear to me that the earliest piece of this is cosmological, not historical.
Interesting. I was just reading an article about the Denizen, the
Yes.
new species of human, and that Tibetans actually have what they have found as a remnant gene that gives them the ability to withstand the elevated areas in Tibet.
Yes,
And they're the
I've
only
heard that
group.
too.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating because, of course, I had to go look in Peru to see if they had any comparison. Apparently, they don't have that same gene in Peru. It's just kind of in Tibet. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. There are things like that make you scratch your head and wonder, what exactly was going on here.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, and then you go, okay, so how do they even fit into this whole cosmological picture? Because I would think they had their own mythology, their own culture, because they didn't go, I'm going to say, extinct till actually, in my opinion, fairly recent.
Right. Well, it's a very stable system that goes along with this cosmology. It creates a model for society that is extremely stable. And my feeling is that it's the same model that Egypt started out with at the time of the first dynastic kingship. And we know that civilization stayed remarkably stable for a period of almost 3,000 years. So it's thinkable that a culture like the Dogon, who seem to have the same tradition, could have sustained that same tradition for an additional 2,000 years beyond what it lasted in Egypt. It's also thinkable that in Tibet they could have sustained it for a very long time.
Oh, definitely, definitely. So we're talking about these different cultures and systems. And one of the things that I know is that you've been working with Stephen Elvin Strong from ForgottenOrigin.com. They're in Australia. And when you look to that culture, I mean, one, do they have any kind of a written language, or have you found any parallels that far out? And you can say it's going to be another book, but I just, give us the teaser if it is.
Okay. Okay. My involvement with the Strongs, it's a nice community of researchers that they have. My involvement has mostly been to look at a couple of specific questions they presented to me and try to give them an opinion from my perspective on what they're looking at. Part of the difficulty in trying to decipher all this stuff is that there are several distinct influences here to be taken account of. There's what happened at 10,000 BC. There's what may have happened before 10,000 BC. And then there seems to be another intervention around 3,200 BC. And so what I see evidence of in Australia relates to the 10,000 BC category, that many of the elements in Australia that the Strongs are working with, from my perspective, come out of a matriarchal tradition that dates to around 10,000 BC out of the Fertile Crescent area. However, that doesn't say that there wasn't a more ancient tradition that was before the end of the Ice Age that also might not also have had influence on Australia, but that I'm not knowledgeable enough to be able to piece together. Mm-hmm. Because my efforts have worked back, started around 3000 BC and now have worked back to around 10,000 BC with little glimmers of what might have happened before that.
Okay. Well, to me, Australia is the big enigma in the whole thing. And I feel like, cracking that and getting more of an understanding of what was going on there would be, I don't know, I feel like they just have a lot of the pieces of the puzzle that we just haven't uncovered yet.
I think they do too. And I think that a lot of the critical pieces might have been submerged at the time of whatever calamity happened around 10,000 BC. So it's hard to piece together what's left.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's kind of true all around the world. You know, we don't know what lies 300 feet underneath the water.
Right. That's right. Now, some of the cultures that I work with, there are definitely language connections between Africa and Australia. A number of the inscriptions that are found in Australia that are being hotly debated as to whether they're authentic or not, and what time period they might come from, and so forth. A lot of the what look like abnormalities in those inscriptions actually make sense in terms of cultures that relate to the Dogon and cultures that relate to the Naki in Tibet. Some of the conventions of how the glyphs were written and so forth that seem like they're not quite Egyptian could be Proto-Egyptian. They could be just prior to writing settling down in Egypt. For example, one of the sets of inscriptions at Gosford, where there have been drawings and inscriptions carved into cliff sides there. One of the typical difficulties that authorities have who come to look at those is they see certain glyphs facing the wrong direction. There are rules to how Egyptian glyphs are supposed to be written. And you read Egyptian hieroglyphs from the direction in which the animals and the people figures in the glyphs are facing. So if an animal is facing to the left, you're reading it from the left. If the animal faces right, you're reading it from the right. They can also be written up and down. Well, at Gosford, you have certain glyphs that suddenly turn around the wrong direction, and it makes it look like they were either written by somebody who didn't know what they were doing in terms of writing Egyptian words, or else it's early enough that it's a legitimate form before these rules of grammar actually settle down. And I found some examples for the Strongs that cited inscriptions in Egypt where some of the glyphs do legitimately face the wrong direction.
But see, that is so cool. That is so cool. And there's such a separation between Australia and Egypt. It doesn't necessarily mean that convention carried everywhere. All right, but let me ask a different question. So, do you believe, or is there belief that the Egyptians were in Australia? Do you think that they were parallel things that they figured out, or do they think that the Australians actually influenced the Egyptians?
That's very hard to say. The book that I'm currently working on, I began thinking I was looking at Egyptian influences on a culture that was distant from Egypt, and have come around to the point of view that it worked the other way. So in Australia, you have certain myths and certain stories that make it look to me as if one of these sanctuaries, one of these training sanctuaries I'm talking about, similar to Göbekli Tepe, might have been located there. And so if that's true, then that could be one of two things. It could be the Egyptians passing along the knowledge that they had received. They come down from 10,000 BC, and sometime later in time, sometime during dynastic Egypt, the Egyptians went to Australia and tried to do the same thing for people there that had been done for them. Or it could be that we're looking at a later effort to establish this civilizing plan that was centered in Australia, trying to work back towards Egypt.
And at this point in time, I guess we just don't know. I mean, not that we will ever know. But
actually, there are ways of knowing fairly certainly, but it comes out of comparing these cultures, and it comes out of really unexpected stuff. This is what's been happening to me lately, is that as I study each of these cultures and I move forward through the regions, there's certain things that tie together and that clearly tie together, and you understand how they fit, pieces of the puzzle. There are other pieces that look like loose ends in one culture, but now you get three cultures down the road and you discover they have references that explain what that loose end is about.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
So
no, I totally agree.
what happens to me lately is that the right loose end falls into place, and suddenly a whole bunch of material comes together that never came together before, and I have an entire book to write that I can sit down and write out from front to back in 5 weeks.
And so, without spilling too many beans, so what is this kind of a summation kind of book, or are you actually exploring a different culture in this new book that you're finishing
Well,
up?
okay, actually, my China book, which I'm actually very interested in and very glad to have in print now, is 3 books back from what I'm currently working on. I have a book that follows the China book called Point of Origin that's due out in February that talks about Göbekli Tepe as a training sanctuary and presents a viewpoint on how that ties forward to India, to Africa, to Egypt, to China, to Tibet. I'm excited about that book a lot.
Well,
But
what's cool is that I get to have you back on in February or March. I
I
can
get
be
to
a
come
little
back.
selfish sometimes.
Me too. But then beyond that, I've got a follow-on book to that deals with this culture that's far distant from Egypt, a culture I knew nothing about. And a friend of mine asked a question. He asked, did I think there's a very archaic site that nobody knows very much about? It doesn't connect to any of the cultures in the region that it's in. The language isn't the same. The architecture isn't the same. The pottery isn't the same. They don't know where it came from. It sort of sprung up out of nowhere around 3200 BC. He wanted to know if I thought there could be Egyptian influence there. And I didn't know anything about that region, but I thought 3200 BC is the period where I place the Dogon with the Egyptians. Essentially, in my outlook, the Dogon were Egyptian at 3200 BC. And the Dogon have done a really good job of preserving all of their traditions down to modern times. So it occurred to me that if there was Egyptian influence there, that I should see commonalities to the Dogon. And so I started looking at those and discovered that there aren't just little commonalities, there are very large commonalities. It's all the same stuff. And I started from the viewpoint that the Dogon represented the source and this other region represented the student. But as I worked it through and traced all the references back and forth and started comparing, here's the Dogon form and here's the other form, I realized I had it backwards. That what I had stumbled on was a source around 3200 BC that seems to have trained the Egyptians and the Dogon, the dynastic Egyptians and the Dogon.
Okay, so you talked about the 10,000 BC at Göbekli Tepe or these other learning centers, and then there's this 32,000 or 3200 BC, which
Right.
seems to be a very common date that you find in cultures around the world having to do with this new beginning
Right.
all
Now,
over.
if you think about it, the Egyptian term first time and the Buddhist term first time instruction was given to humanity, both of those terms imply that there was more than one time. There was more than one attempt. And so it makes sense to me that at 3200 BC you have a renewed attempt to reestablish kingships around the world based on agriculture after the earlier attempts had just not taken the way they should have. I mean, you have signs in Egypt that there was there were early kingships before the first dynasty that we don't know very much about. There were certainly religious traditions that tie back to the era of Göbekli Tepe that I have looked into. But that was a matriarchal tradition, and what survived in Egypt was a patriarchal one. And so one of the questions I was asking was, how come in all these cultures around 3200 BC you see this flip in symbolism of certain kinds of symbols? What was given in terms of a mother goddess originally is now being given in terms of a creator god. And you have all sorts of other changes in language and changes in symbols and changes in meanings of symbols. And changes in roles of deities that happen around 3200 BC, but they don't happen just in one culture. They happen in many different cultures all at the same moment. And that implies to me that you have some globally capable influence affecting all of these places.
And so do you think it was these spiritual beings that the Dogon talk of that brought this about, or a different group, or any conjecture?
I think it was a related group, but I can see that at 3200 BC, the cosmology basically got reformulated. That certain changes in symbolism happened so that processes that happen in the macrocosm, the universe, relate to, say, animals that are large as opposed to animals that are small. There are little adjustments that are being made here and there to make sure that you have agreement between the form of the symbol and the concept that weren't there originally. And so it looks like, and then at the same time, you suddenly have symbolic language appear in all these different cultures based on cosmology, based on the new reformulated cosmology. And so and you also have a really well-conceived kingship in Egypt, and there's some other places where you also have well-conceived kingships happen, and a societal form that now is able to hold together, and a plan for agriculture that sustains itself. Something happened at 3200 BC, and I think it reflects the hand of someone who is connected to those original teachers, maybe not precisely the same group.
And brought forward this whole, I mean, because that's when, we started having quote unquote culture, written language, cities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it all kind of coagulates right all into that one time period.
Right. And so the region that I'm studying, it looks like a very coherent training center got created around 3200 BC, and then suddenly, about 100 years later, you start seeing its effects in particular regions of the world.
Interesting. And by that time, Göbekli Tepe would have been
long gone.
Long gone.
Yes. Right. Now that's an interesting question in itself. These gigantic pillars that were put up on this mountaintop in Turkey that created stone circles, basically. They were in use for about 1,000 years, and then they were deliberately and carefully buried. Now, it's a really interesting fact that they were carefully and deliberately buried in such a way as to not damage any of the intricate carvings on the stones, because there aren't very many motivations that justify doing that. Imagine what it would take to get a group of 1950 Catholics to bury their cathedral. Or imagine what it would have taken to get the ancient Greeks to bury the Parthenon.
Well, I'm going to throw a concept out at you, and I hate to do this on air, but I was reading this book about taboos and the whole concept of taboo, and it made me think, and I'm just throwing this little tidbit, that perhaps the whole ground was seen as being taboo, and in order to protect people from getting taboo because they touched something that was taboo, they buried it.
That would work for me, except that I would expect them not to give two whits about whether they damaged it then. As a matter of fact, they would almost prefer to damage it. And what we see at Göbekli Tepe is that these structures get covered over very carefully. And to my way of thinking, there are really only two motivations that make sense. One is that they were trying to hide it from a second group. Say you had a group of teachers who were teaching us things that some second group didn't approve of. They might want to bury it so that the second group didn't find out about it. And that goes along with the whole idea of the esoteric tradition itself, where if you're a priest and I'm a student, and I ask you a question that's appropriate to my status as a student, you're required to give me a truthful answer. But if I ask you a question that's not, that's inappropriate to my status, you're required to remain silent or to lie if you have to. Now, that kind of a tradition, like in Dogon culture, any Dogon tribesperson, if they want to pursue it, can learn all of the innermost secrets of the tradition if they continue to ask the right questions. But an outsider who comes in and starts asking questions will be met with silence. That kind of a tradition is designed to hide information from an outsider. So I ask myself, who would that outsider have been? It implies to me that we had two groups involved, one that was actively trying to help us and one that was trying to prevent them from helping us. So the first motivation for burying Göbekli Tepe in my mind is to hide it from somebody else. The second possibility is that they hid it for posterity. They buried it for posterity. They knew that if they covered it up, that down the line there would be a group like us who would find it, and when we uncovered it, we would be able to learn all sorts of things about what really happened back in those times because it was covered up. So those are my two likeliest possibilities. I know there are some researchers who think that, well, there was a gigantic calamity about to happen and they knew that it was going to happen and they decided to bury this temple to protect it. But that doesn't make much sense to me because we're talking about a period where there are hunter-gatherers who basically have, arrows and bows and stones and axes. Now, here you have the single thing in your culture that's likely to survive a calamity, and rather than devoting your time to protecting yourself so that you survive, you devote your time to burying the one thing that's likely to survive anyway. That doesn't make sense to me.
This is true. I don't know how much you have actually studied the carvings in Göbekli Tepe, but since we're talking about it, are there any symbols that relate back to Dogon or Egyptian or Chinese cosmology?
Yes, and actually, Göbekli Tepe provided me with one of the keys I needed for the China book, because in the China book was the first time when I had a situation where I didn't have firm written text to rely on to tell me what they thought was true. So I had to find other ways of getting at what must be true in the absence of those texts. And so I knew from Göbekli Tepe that I could see that the animals carved on these pillars, many of them were animals that are important to Dogon cosmology. I know what they represent. They're symbolic. But there were certain animals that didn't connect to the system the way I understood it. And I was really interested in those animals because if my theory was that this was a cosmological site, why are these other animals that have no bearing on cosmology there? And so I know that the farther back in time I go, the more commonality of language I find. For example, the word tepe in the Turkish language has about 25 different meanings. If you go to the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary, you find at least a dozen of those meanings represented by similar phonetic values in the language. In other words, when the ancient Egyptians said tepe, they meant the same thing that the modern Turks mean when they say tepe. So there's commonality of language as you go back in time. And so I looked at the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary at the names for these animals I didn't understand, and I noticed that not only those animals, but all the other animals that were pictured, the name of the animal is pronounced like a term of cosmology. In other words, the animals symbolized a stage of cosmology. So I could imagine that what you had on these pillars at Göbekli Tepe was a kind of proto-writing, where a hunter-gatherer who knew what an animal looked like and he knew what its name was, but didn't know how to read, could walk up to a pillar, see a picture of an animal, say its name, and at the same time speak the term of cosmology he was going to be taught there.
Laird, I am looking at the clock, and we need to go take a quick break. And let's come back to that topic when we're on the other side, okay?
That sounds good.
Okay, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're here talking to Laird Scranton about his new book, flip the page, China's Cosmological Prehistory. And we'll be back with Laird after these words from our sponsors. Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. We're here talking with Laird Scranton about his book, China's Cosmological Prehistory. But don't forget, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. and soulhealer.com, where you can find out about all the products and services that I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, energy healing, and psychic readings. And so, Laird, are you still there?
Yep, I'm still here.
So somebody posted in the chat room, actually it was RW, but he goes, Rita, you're so doggone cute. It's like, okay, don't make me laugh when I'm trying to like do introduction stuff. But okay, so when we went to the break, we were talking about the animals that are carved into the obelisks, the
Right.
megaliths in Göbekli Tepe.
Right.
And so I want to throw this out and get your take on it or your thought. I was in Alamogordo, New Mexico, at one of the petroglyph parks there. And we were, of course, I had to like touch everything and run around and touch everything. And there was this guy there who was writing a book. And so he started talking to us about, some of the symbology. But one of the things that he was really talking about was the mnemonics of there's this symbol. And he talked about that the stories were told in the round. And so you looked over here and it was this piece of the story. And then you looked over here and it was this piece of the story. And then you saw this carving on a rock over here because it was going around in this circle. And so based on what you have been looking at, could that be a possibility that there's actually a bigger story going on around in these circles?
Sure, absolutely. And the idea of a circle is, of sitting in a circle for rituals like that, is one that connects back to this tradition that I carry things forward with. But because I understood that these animals at Göbekli Tepe looked like they were cosmological, when I got to researching the China book and had to write about the zodiac, my first impulse was that the animals on the zodiac represent a series of stages of creation. And so I started looking at the names, the Egyptian names for those animals and what they represent, and was able to lay out a coherent set of stages of creation that tie back to Chinese words and tie back to Chinese concepts that make the zodiac look like that's what it also represents. There are similar elements with the Dogon. Marcel Griol, who is the French anthropologist who studied the Dogon, said that all of the elements of the zodiac existed in Dogon culture, but they hadn't been brought together into one symbol.
When you talk about the Egyptian zodiac, is their cosmology the same as the one that we know today, like Aries and Sagittarius and Leo, or did they have a different system? A similar but different system. How's that?
Okay, there are differences from culture to culture because the idea was that the symbols that you saw in your daily life were supposed to reinforce concepts of cosmology. And so you have a cobra in India, you might have a rattlesnake in North America. The comparable symbol, but a different animal. Mm-hmm. You have, vultures in Turkey, and you might have some other kind of bird of prey in another culture, and so forth. So, yes, they were the same conceptually, but they weren't precisely the same in terms of all of their specific elements. You're not going to find a tiger in Great Britain, so this was cast in a way that was generic, but it was also tailored to the culture that it was in.
But in Egypt, did they have a monthly? I'm
Yes.
sitting there going, okay, wait a minute. They had a 10-day week, so I'm not even sure how that would all fit in, but I'm just going to skip that part. I mean, because in China, they do everything by the year of the pig, the year of the snake.
Yes. Well, that's interesting because, yes, the zodiac that you find in cultures like ancient Egypt, you're talking about relationships to constellations that have ranges of symbolism associated with them. For instance, these constellations each were configured to represent an hour of the night sky. They moved at a certain rate across the sky. Basically, they look like they move because the Earth's rotating. So you could use these constellations that tie back to the zodiac as a clock to tell what time of the night it was. But you can also use the constellations from a precessional standpoint, that very slow movement of constellations behind the sun that takes thousands and thousands of years to move around as a gigantic slow clock. That's an aspect of it. And these same constellations were used to regulate the agricultural cycle. So there was an annual aspect to them also. When a certain constellation rose above the horizon, it was time to plant, and so forth. So there are multiple levels of symbolism. Okay, in China, somehow that got permuted or the permutation was to a system that repeats a cycle of years. That may just be another element to it, or another level of symbolism to the Chinese zodiac that got forgotten elsewhere or never got created elsewhere, where there's this cycle of years, of 12 years that go around the zodiac. What year were you born in, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm glad you weren't asking me, because I'd have to lie. 1986. That
Right.
sounds like a good year. Yeah.
So yes, all of the elements are the same from culture to culture, from a generic perspective, but they differ in the way they were implemented at the end, and you also got thousands of years of time for them to change and to mutate. And it's cultures like the Dogon who devoted themselves to not letting it mutate that give us the control to judge things against.
Mm-hmm. What I find interesting is in that kind of system, in a zodiac kind of system, we don't find, or the system that was in place with like the Maya is, I'm going to say on the surface, very different. Their method of calendar keeping was very different than what we find in Egypt and China.
Right. And what you really have to look to in order to be able to have a basis for comparison is you have to be comparing apples to apples at a period of time. And so I'll compare two cultures at 3200 BC, or I'll compare two cultures at 10,000 BC, or I'll compare two cultures later on down the line. But the closer to modern you get, the more chance it has had to mutate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we know nothing really about the Olmec culture, which predated the Maya. And wouldn't that be awesome if we found a bunch of Olmec stuff?
Yeah, it would be really, really neat, because not very much is known about the Olmecs. But what is known about them looks like it ties to Africa.
Interesting. Well, yeah, the faces, but even their artwork, their burial mass are magnificent. Magnificent. Right. So let's kind of back up, because we're talking about China, and we talked a little bit about civilization in China. And you said that civilization began around 3,200 BC in China, quote unquote.
Right, around the same, circa the same era, you have the same things happening. You have the first civic centers forming that looked a lot and functioned a lot like the civic centers in Egypt. Agriculture appears about the same time. Writing appears about the same time. So there's a lot of parallelism. The problem is that in China, we don't have as much definitive evidence to be able to anchor things down and say this is definitely what happened. I'll give you an example. There's a tradition in China of the 8 teachers, the 8 sages. Just like all the other cultures have the tradition of the 8 teachers, so does China. The problem is that you can't get any two scholars to agree on which 2 emperors or sages represented these 8. They have a group of them that are candidates, and then you sort of have to pick and choose depending on what your viewpoint is as to which 8 really represented the 8. And so everything in China is that way. It's all carved in mud, and it's very hard to write about it because there's nothing definite.
Well, how old does their writing system go? Not necessarily any books or literature, but just, their writing symbolic system.
Okay, well, this also ties back to the Velikovsky book I wrote. Um, the earliest writing system in China was called the oracle bone glyphs, the oracle bone writing. These are characters that were carved into bones of animals, like the large neck bones of cattle or the flat undersides of a turtle shell. And a lot of the characters are very similar to the characters that of later Chinese language and of Egyptian language. I show some of them in my book and compare them to Egyptian and traditional Chinese characters. But the traditional viewpoint on that oracle bone writing is that it was developed specifically to track the movements of Venus. And that's what ties back to Velikovsky. There's an outlook that says that Venus was a source of great fear in ancient times, great enough that an entire system of writing in China was developed simply to track where Venus was. And that happens around 1700 BC.
That's really interesting. And I'm asking because there is so much that seems to be coming out of China. Some fantastic like dinosaur bones, that have feathers on them, and things that no one even knew existed, that they're finding in the desert. I'll just say desert because I can't think of the name. Anyway, Gobi Desert. I want to say Gobekli, and I'm like, no, that ain't it. Do you think, again, speculation on your part, that they might at some point in time find some city like Gobekli Tepe, perhaps buried in the sand out there or off on some mountain that hasn't been explored?
Yes, particularly if it was a part of the plan to bury the sanctuaries after they were done using them, which looks like it's possible to me. There's an Egyptian word that means to cover over, but the symbols of the word read protect knowledge before knowledge is destroyed. That's the way I read the symbols that write the word. So based on that, it looks to me like it's possible that this was a deliberate attempt to bury this stuff so that it could be found at a later point in time. But if that's the case, then there could very well have been high mountaintop sanctuaries from 10,000 BC era in China that are buried that we haven't found yet.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the Egyptians seem to have known about a lot of these sanctuaries. They have archaic sanctuary names that some of them identify places that I don't know where they are, but I can tell from the form of the word that it's one of these sanctuary names.
How do you mean?
Well, okay, there's one that was a term for the general region of Turkey where Gobekli Tepe is that's pronounced Get Petkai. This is an Egyptian term, I believe, for the sanctuary at Gobekli Tepe. But they have, and for each of those foreign sanctuaries, they have a localized Egyptian sanctuary that has a similar name that's in one of their major centers. And so you can tell by the form of the name and the fact that they have a localized temple with the same name that it probably was one of these sanctuaries. So there are other names that fit this category, but I don't know what sanctuary it refers to. I know that I can presume that there is one out there buried that we haven't found, but I don't know which one it is yet.
And how many of these names have you uncovered? Curious, sir.
Well, I've actively worked with 3 or 4 of them. Actually, it ties into the latest book also that there are terms that look like they are later permutations of these archaic sanctuary names that tie into the book that I'm writing about 3200 BC. But
okay.
from the 10,000 BC era, I have probably 4 or 5 names, and I'm sure there are more that I could find in the Egyptian Hieroglyphic Dictionary, but I've tried to focus on the ones that I have an idea of where they are and what they were about. Mm-hmm. Another feature of these names is they were built on what looks like the names of 3 deities but on another level, they were also the name of 3 astronomical bodies. And so it basically says Temple of Sirius, Orion, and Barnard's Loop. Or it says Temple of Isis, Osiris, and some other deity's name. And so you can look at these words and see that the component elements of the words tie to names of deities and tie to names of astronomic bodies, and that's a tip-off that you've got a sanctuary name.
Cool. And so when you look at the astronomical bodies tied to it, I mean, do the same ones come up over and over? You mentioned Orion and Sirius. Do they come up when you look at these other ones, or do other bodies come up?
I don't have enough examples to be able to say definitively, but I know that Giza is one of these sanctuaries. The ancient names for Giza look like it was one of those sanctuaries. And it ties to the same astronomic bodies. It ties to Sirius, to Orion, and to a third astronomic body, what I call Barnard's Loop. Barnard's Loop is a spiraling birthplace of stars. It's a spiral that you can't really see without time-lapse photography because it's so faint. The light that it emits is so faint. But when you do image it, it looks like a spiral that wraps around the belt stars of Orion.
Well, and I just find, the reference to those points just so shocking to come up again and again and again all over the place. Which is yet another consistent theme that we find.
There are reasons for that. And I get to this in the Point of Origin book that's due out in February. But basically it boils down to concepts that relate to, there's a concept called ascension. Ascension, you can look at ascension as sort of a psychological or a spiritual process a person can go through. Ascension also is a term that relates to progressive stages of matter as matter is formed. But there's also a macrocosmic component to it that talks about how our universe relates to things outside of our universe. And these astronomic bodies of Sirius and Orion and Barnard's Loop have direct bearing on that macrocosmic view of ascension.
Do you find references to those same bodies in China?
Yes. You really find it everywhere. For example, you've got in Egypt, you've got Isis and Nephthys. Isis, everyone understands that Isis is symbolic of Sirius. But what they don't always understand is that Isis has a dark sister named Nephthys. And in the Sirius star system, there are really 2 stars, not one. There's a bright one like our sun, and there's a very dark dwarf star that you can't see because of the glare of the bright star. And so anytime in another culture, when you come across 2 goddesses who have that kind of a sisterly relationship, the suspicion is that you're talking about the stars of Sirius.
Interesting. So I'm looking at the clock, and I just want to move along because there's still more stuff to talk about. One of the things that you talked about in your book that I have actually never heard of before, which kind of surprised me, was something called the well field system.
Right.
What is it, and why is it important?
Okay, that's a very deep question. Okay, in China, the best perspective on it, the overview perspective is from China. The detail comes from the Dogon. In China, land, the concept of land in any size unit relates to the number 9. They conceived of 9 continents that they considered China to be the central of the 9 continents. When you get down to the level of a city, you've got cities designed around 9 square spaces. And when you get down to an agricultural field, you also have the basic plot of agricultural land defined in terms of 9 square spaces that form a larger square. It's a 3 by 3 set that creates 9 squares. And in China, this plan was considered to be purely theoretical. Even though there are some regions of China where they know it was implemented, the scholars are still claiming that it was purely theoretical, not actually implemented. But for the Dogon, it was actually implemented. And the Dogon know what it's about. The idea is that 8 families would be assigned, each assigned one of these 9 plots, and then they would all share the central plot, which would consist of a well to provide water for the other 8 plots. And each family would derive the benefit from the plot that they farmed. It was sort of a communal system. It was called the well field system because of that central well. Now you go to China, you have exactly the same system presented as if it was purely theoretical, but we can see based on Dogon details that it probably was implemented also in China, and it goes along with every other concept of land management in China at every level. So it only makes sense that they implemented it also. But it's a very, very interesting system because it demonstrates that there was an organized system of agriculture that all the people in this culture were trying to adhere to. Somebody had imposed from the outside a plan of how you do this. People were not just haphazardly plowing their fields, they were plowing them in a particular way. Also, the measurements of these squares are given in cubits, and cubits are what I consider to be one of the signatures of this cosmology. If a culture uses cubits, chances are they knew about the whole system. And so the fact that China used cubits to measure out these plots of land is another indicator that we're talking about the same system.
They use cubits? Really?
Right. Yes. And pretty much every culture did. You find it everywhere. There's an author named
there's no way. I thought it was only in the Bible. Then, and Noah made it so many cubits by so many cubits.
No. There's a book called Historical Metrology. It was written by A.E. Berriman. And he talks about ancient units of measure. And he has an entire chapter on cubits and all the different cultures that had cubits and all the differences in size of the cubits. The thing about a cubit is that it was a way of measuring geometry. All of these ancient cultures had what I refer to as an aligned ritual shrine. It's a kind of a little temple that their initiates were taught to build. It's a grand symbol for this system of cosmology, and the way you align it to the cardinal points of east, west, north, and south is using a particular set of geometry. And the way you measure that geometry is with a cubit. And a cubit represents either the distance from a person's elbow to the tip of their middle finger, or it can be measured as the average step or pace of a person. Now, the reason why you end up with, now everybody's arm is a slightly different length and everybody's pace is a slightly different length. You don't have a standardized unit of measure for a cubit. This is a relative unit of measure. But the reason it works is because the geometry tree only cares about the relationship of the shapes. It doesn't care how big they are. And so,
if I'm the one that's doing all the measuring, it's always my arm, and so it's going to be proportional, not my arm and then someone who's really short. Now one side's going to be all off kilter.
That's right. And each person without access to tools can measure it, or most people can, because most people are going to have an arm or they're going to be able to walk and take a pace. And so the teachers didn't have to be concerned about how are we going to get rulers for everybody, or how are we going to get compasses for everybody, or whatever it happened to be. We don't have tools here. All we've got are sticks and fields, and that's all they need to be able to produce this stuff. And the alignment of this shrine recreates the earliest stages of creation of matter and of the universe. And so the initiate is learning about the processes of creation at the same time they're aligning this shrine. one of the ways that I knew that ancient China connected to my system was because a professor who taught at Vassar College when I was there, but I never took his class, and a well-known anthropology professor named Walter Fairservice, had done a study of ancient Chinese cities, and his assertion was that they were all aligned to the cardinal points using a particular method, and the method he describes is the method that applies to these ritual shrines. That one of the shrines is called the stupa in India, or in Buddhism it's called the stupa, and it's sort of the grand symbol of the creation plan. So the fact that these well-field plots were measured out in cubits is a signature that ties the China well-field plan to the Dogon well-field plan. They both use cubits. It had to have come from the same place.
Yeah, that only makes sense. You know, and this whole weld field system, in reading about it, one of the things that it made me to think about, which is yet another concept that comes out of Chinese cosmology, is the whole idea of the bagua, you know, which is the octagon that's broken up into 8 sections with the square or octagon in the center, depending on how you draw it out, you know, but it's also that same kind of grid pattern. Was there any
That's right.
parallels to that?
Yeah, these are all variations on a theme, and the best representation of what these things look like in their earliest form is that I know of is the Dogon culture. But you can find early representations in other cultures. For example, I was comparing the plan of a house, the way the Dogon lay it out, to the plan of a house in this other region that I was asked to explore. And I thought it was very interesting because the Dogon plan is laid out like Schwaller de Lubitz's Temple of Man. It's laid out to represent a human body, actually a woman's body. And so it has a room that represents a head and rooms that represent arms and so forth. In Dogon country, the temperature is so hot in the desert that they don't need a fireplace. But in the other region that I was exploring, it's a little cooler temperature, and they needed fireplaces, which they called hearths, and the hearth was placed in the same position that your heart would be in a body. And I thought that's very interesting that they started with a plan that didn't include a hearth, and they added one, but when they added it with the right symbolism for the plan. That was one of my clues that I had things backwards. It wasn't that this second culture added the hearth, it's that the Dogon removed it because they didn't need it. And so the tradition is flowing the opposite direction from what I initially thought it was.
Cool. You know, but I think that's one of the things that is so interesting in doing this work is you start off in one place and you follow it down the rabbit hole, and sometimes where you end up is not where you thought you would.
That's right. And I have a couple of rules for myself about doing it, because just like Jung said, you know, our brains are wired to see things in a particular way. And one of the things we're wired to do is to find patterns even when they don't exist. You know, you're a child and you're lying in the grass looking up at the sky, you see the clouds, and every child imagines pictures. They see animals and they see shapes and they see airplanes, and they see objects, and they see, you know, everything except clouds, right? We're wired to look at things that way. And so one of the biggest concerns for somebody in my field is, how do you distinguish between a wishful interpretation and one that's real? And so I make a couple of rules for myself. The first rule is that every interpretation has to start with an explicit statement on the part of the culture that I'm studying. And if possible, it's confirmed by a second culture. I want to know that they looked at it this way and I'm following it because they looked at it this way, not because I am.
Okay, so they said ask J3's question, but I'm not seeing the question because it's not in caps. So J3, if there really is a question for me to ask, you need to repost it for me to find it. So I'm just gonna move along. Okay.
The other rule I make for myself is that by the time I finish an interpretation, I have to be able to complete a very simple sentence. The sentence is, we know this must be true because, and with one or two words, be able to finish it. If I can do that, then I know I'm on firm ground. I can defend whatever it is I'm interpreting. It's got to be true because blah, 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 blah.
You mean so, and it wouldn't work like, because Rita told me?
Well, of course that works.
Rita told me. Yeah, okay. But those are good rules of thumb. I mean, I feel like, one of the things that I really appreciate about the work that you do is that you ask yourself questions and then you leave yourself open to discovering what the answer is versus thinking you already have the answer before you even ask the question.
Well, it's tricky to train yourself to look at things that way because it's so tempting to form an opinion and then go chase it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay. I talked about that. All right. So one of the things, in our earlier discussion about the Dogon, we talked about how the Dogon used their symbology to share their advanced understanding of concepts of science and physics. Do you find a similar depth of knowledge in Chinese cosmology?
It's there, but they don't really understand that it's there. In a lot of cultures, when you start at 3200 BC, it seems to be there for all the cultures I study, that they had an intact set of this stuff to start out with. But it's like, your Monopoly game, suddenly you lost the battleship, and suddenly you lost one of the dice, and now you don't have half of your chance cards, and so forth. The farther down the line you get from the new set, the fewer pieces you have of it. That's the way it goes with most cultures. But in a few cultures like the Dogon, where they maintain a certain discipline, actually a very strict discipline about how information is passed, they manage to keep this stuff straight. Buddhism did the same thing. And the way we know it is because Buddhism was documented around 400 BC, and we know that the way it's described now by people like Adrian Snodgrass is the same as it was then. It hasn't changed since 400 BC. The Dogon system matches what the Buddhists described at 400 BC, and so we know it hasn't changed in that period of time. As a matter of fact, the Dogon system is given using ancient Egyptian words that went out of use around 700 BC, so the Dogon system, we can trace that back even farther than the Buddhist system. We know that it hasn't changed since at least 700 BC. And so we're dealing with systems that we can count on the fact that they're ancient and that they haven't changed. So now, anything either one of those two cultures tell us about this system that agrees with each other, we have to allow for the possibility that it's true because they both kept everything straight. I got into a discussion with Graham Hancock at one point about the possibility of could there have been alien involvement in ancient Egypt? And his position was that we don't really have any firm evidence that we can point to that says that there could have been. And my outlook is, I've got a problem because of this rule I made for myself about interpretations. I've got two different cultures who flatly say that there was non-human involvement in ancient times. And if
Laird, you came over to the dark side.
No, but I mean, if I live by my own rules, I have to at least allow that possibility. I don't necessarily have to subscribe to it, but I can't flatly rule it out because two of my cultures are flatly saying it's true.
And, I'm just asking you all kinds of weird stuff tonight, and I'm sorry about that because I'm just like, this is just such an enjoyable conversation. Have you ever looked at Hebrew text and to see if that also carries the same kind of symbology or hidden messages that you find in Egyptian or, because it seems like in Hebrew script, you don't really get the Egyptian flavor, but it almost, to me, has almost more of a Chinese flavor to it.
Okay, the answer to your questions are yes and yes. I have looked at it, and yes, there are commonalities. That, in fact, many of the Dogon words that I correlate to Egyptian words are also Hebrew words. In fact, Sir Wallace Budge, who wrote the dictionary, the Egyptian dictionary that I work with, oftentimes will use Hebrew letters or Hebrew words as a basis of comparison to the Egyptian to tell you how to pronounce something or to explain what something means. And so there's commonality across the board here. One nice feature of the system is that every word carries at least two meanings. For example, the Dogon hidden god Amma, his name also means to grasp or to hold firm or to establish. In Egypt, the counterpart to Amma is Amen. He's the hidden god, and his name also means to grasp or to hold firm. I read an article a few years back by a Hebrew language scholar who was arguing that the Hebrew word Amen that comes at the end of prayers can't be related to the Egyptian word Amen, the Egyptian god Amen, because it comes from a Hebrew root word that means to establish. Well, he didn't understand that he just shot himself in the foot with that argument, because to establish is one of the meanings that connects it, not that disconnects it.
So I know that we're not really talking about India, but when you're talking about these parallels, and if I'm recalling correctly, wasn't there a story that you shared with me in your home about grasping or embracing that had to do with Ganesh, but also had to do with your investigation of this whole process?
Yes, that's true.
It was such a cool story, so I was just wondering if you would share.
I probably can't share the whole thing, because this is one of the central pieces of the book that'll be out in February, and so I can't really talk about it ahead of time. But I can.
Then never mind. Nope.
No. There are things I can certainly tell you about it. The idea of grasping and holding firm is central to all of these creator gods and mother goddesses. That's one of the things they all do. That's why you have deities associated with vultures who grasp things with their talons. And that's why you have this notion of grasping and holding firm and establishing things. What it really comes down to is, when you get to the bottom of it, is the way that these cultures, including Judaism, including the Buddhists, including the Dogon, including the Egyptians, conceptualize our universe. That when you get to the bottom of it, what they all say is that universes form in pairs. And those pairs consist of one universe that is material in nature, like ours, and the other one is non-material in nature, like the one the Dogon said they teachers came from. Now, all creation that we see depends on an interaction between those two universes that's comparable to the natural water cycle in agriculture. That what happens in the natural water cycle is that water evaporates from the ocean to form clouds. The clouds rise up over the mountains and drop their rain. The rain runs down the mountains in rivers back to the ocean, and then the cycle starts over again. If that cycle were abrupted, all life would end on the earth, because you need that cycle to grow anything, for anything to live. Well, according to these traditions, at the bottom of creation, we've got that kind of an energy relationship between a material universe and a non-material one. And without that flow of energy, you don't have life. And that the concept of that interaction between the two universes is conceptualized in relation to the mother goddess. And what the mother goddess does, essentially, is she hugs or embraces.
Well, but you find that same concept of hugging and embracing, when they talk about, the heavens and the earth were separated from each other. I mean, in Polynesian mythology, they were held in a firm embrace until their children separated them apart. And, then they were sad and blah, 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 blah. And the story goes on. I'm listening to you talk, And so many of the concepts that you're sharing sound like they came out of some new age book that have been out and available and on the market, that it sounds like, in quantum physics, I feel like they're coming back to concepts that are covered in those types of books. And it sounds like in your work, you're actually finding that you're coming back to concepts that are found in those kind of books, talking about multiple worlds and different levels of vibration of energy and things
Yes.
like that.
It's all the same stuff. The difference is that the ancient system goes a little bit farther than our scientific system is able to go right now.
Well, yeah.
I would say approximately 50 years farther. If the scientists would pay attention to what the ancient traditions were saying, they might be able to still shortcut their process a little bit. I think that was part of the original plan, was that after 500 or 1,000 years, we would have progressed far enough to notice that our religion looked like an awful lot like our science. And once we noticed that, then we could just follow where the religion pointed us to the correct science. It was a shortcut.
But see, we haven't found the black obelisk yet on the moon.
Yes.
And so, we're behind the power curve here.
That's right. So yes, it's all the same stuff. You find it in Kabbalism. You find it in you see the seeds of it everywhere. I see it in China. Every culture I've looked at, every ancient culture that dates from 3200 BC or before has this stuff.
Sweet. So to the scholars that assume that a convention such as utilizing animals as symbols in cultures, they put out that they were animal worshipers. Would you agree with that statement? I mean, were they animal worshipers as well as using them as cosmological symbols, or do you think that they were just using them as cosmological symbols?
No, what happened was that the system of cosmology is inherently, well, from our perspective, is inherently atheistic in that there is not an actual concept of worship. There's, in each culture, in the ancient cultures, there's one deity who might rise to the level of a god in a modern religion, usually the person who initiates creation, like the goddess Neith in Egypt, or like Amma for the Dogon. But these concepts of creation, these stages of creation that were defined in relation to animals and relation to other symbolic elements, ended up over time being sort of anthropomorphized, that the stage of creation ended up being reflected as if it were a person doing things. It's a way of remembering it. And so myths about gods performing certain acts was a way of remembering, a mnemonic way of remembering that stage of creation. And the animals became icons of the gods and goddesses. In India, you can positively assert which god or goddess, even though there are thousands of different forms, you can positively assert which god or goddess you're looking at pictured in an icon because of the animal that's associated with it. For example, Ganesha is always associated with a mouse. So the animals, there's no element in the entire system that doesn't play multiple roles in a very complicated system. And in order to be able to talk about any symbol's meaning, you have to specify what theme of the cosmology are we talking about, what theme of creation are we talking about. But there's intelligence to the system. Like when you're talking about animals, insects relate to early stages of creation and birds relate to latest stages. And yeah, it goes insects, fish, four-legged animals, and then birds. So if you have a deity who has symbolism that relates to a bird, you know you're talking about one of the topmost levels of creation.
Interesting. And so it's also possible that cultures that had animal totems, their different groups had animal totems, might have been keepers of certain amount of wisdom or a certain, I'm going to say energy vibration, certain pattern that was assigned to them to take care of or whatever. Bit of information.
Yes, actually, these ancient tribes, there are naming conventions for the tribes. The naming convention is that the name of the tribe was based on the stage of creation or the deity, if you want to look at it that way, that they celebrated or they praised. It's as if they were, in college you major in a certain subject. It's like each of these tribes majored in a certain stage of creation. And so they had a tribal deity who represented that stage. And you can tell by the name of the tribe. In China, the term Fuxi, which is the name of the creator god, means celebrates the four. His other name is Poxi, which means celebrates the nine. Celebrating the nine is a reference to land management. Celebrates the four is an alternate way of looking at land management. So you have a god whose fundamental symbolism relates to the earth, which is symbolic of the processes, quote unquote, below as opposed to above. The mother goddess has symbolism that relates to above, which is the universe or the cosmos. And the entire purpose of the tradition is to reconcile what happens in this above realm with what happens in the earthly realm, which is reconciling that non-material universe with the material one.
But that makes a lot of sense when you start looking at some of these cultures that do have animal worship, totem worship. There are clear traditions that say, if you're from a squirrel clan, you can marry somebody from these very specific clans, but you can't marry these, and these ones are taboo to you. And there are these very strict rules, but I never looked at it as kind of a separation, class separation by animals.
No, and it really isn't class separation.
But you know what I'm saying.
Throughout this system, there was division of labor that was deliberate. For example, the guy who made the tools for agriculture in the Dogon culture was prohibited from farming. What it looks like to me is that what was being set up was the necessary requirements for an economy. In an economy, you need different people performing different functions so that you can have this flow of this economic flow that creates the life of a community. And you don't get that if you don't have division of labor. There was male-female division of labor that was partly predicated on making it possible to have a family. This is the kind of stuff that's being completely dropped from society since the 1960s. Mm-hmm. That we're making it impossible for a couple to have a family. They can't afford to anymore. You can't have division of labor. Everybody has to work. Everybody has to do the same thing. They have to go out and work for money if they want to be able to survive. In the 1950s, you could have a division of labor. One partner could stay home with kids and the other partner could go work, and there was a flow. So what looks to us as if it might be sexist or might be classist really started out as a division of labor that was required to have a successful society. And one of those divisions is somebody's got to stay home with kids and somebody's got to work.
And now everybody just works too many hours a day. 10 days a week. God.
Yeah, where were the Beatles when we needed them?
That's right. So we only have a couple of minutes left. So you have your new book, Point of Origin, coming out in February.
That's right. And then a follow-on book, which I have not yet submitted to the publisher, but is pretty close to finished. I'm tentatively calling it The Overthrown Boat.
Well, do you think that name will stick?
I don't think that it will, but when you get into the symbolism of what's going on, it's an important term. And it's one that I actually start to discuss in Point of Origin. With Point of Origin, the title, it's hard to explain how this material came together for me, but it came together with the title sort of as a bundle. Both of the new books sort of fell out as a whole bundle along with their titles. And so I feel like a kind of an obligation to use the title that came with the material. Mm-hmm. It's hard to explain. So with Point of Origin, it almost came to fisticuffs with the committee that assigns titles with my publisher. to try to get them to actually use the title that we agreed we were going to use.
But I mean, point of origin, I don't know. I think that is attracting, and I think it has good marketability.
Yes. Overthrown boat may not, but...
Yeah, it makes me think of that Rock the Boat song, Okay. And,
so I don't know whether that title will survive or not, but that's my starting point.
Okay. If people want your books, if they want to get a hold of you, all that good stuff, because we have...
Okay, let's see. Yeah, innertraditions.com is my publisher. They have my books. You can also find my books at pretty much any of the normal outlets, Amazon, or any bookstore will order it, or some will carry it. Let's see. Best way to contact me if you want to reach me, there is a LairdScranton.com that's not actually my website, but the contact form reaches me. It was developed by a fan, and it remains the fan's site, but it's a good representation of what I'm doing. I also have a Facebook page. People are welcome to friend me on Facebook. That's a good way to find me.
Well, alrighty.
I'll be appearing at various conferences this year. One is the CPAK conference in California, in Rancho Mirage, California, the third week in October. That's hosted by Walter Cruttenden. And I'll be back at Paradigm this year, where you and I were 2 years ago. They have it's a good conference. They have a glut of speakers this year. I don't know how they're going to find time in their schedule. They're going to have the speakers speaking when people are trying to sleep. I think they have so many speakers.
They're waiting for their food. Anyway, I know the music.
The second week.
Yeah.
The first week in October.
All right. I know the music's rolling, so we got to go. Anyway,
thanks,
you
Rita.
so much for coming on, and I will contact you about having you come on late February, early March to talk about point of origin.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Rita.
All right. Talk to you later, Laird.
Yep.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
And next week, we have John Hogue coming on talking about Nostradamus, predictions, and the future. And so until then, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point your